Okay, this time round we're going to be talking about Altered States, which is a 1980 film directed by Ken Russell and written by Paddy Chevsky. I think probably the most succinct synopsis for it, although we are going to go into massive spoilers beyond this later on, is from Mubi. In search of the ultimate truth, a determined psychiatrist, William Hurt, takes hallucinatory drugs and undergoes sensory deprivation. But when he starts experiencing physiological changes, his wife, Blair Brown, and colleagues Bob Balaban and Charles Hayde begin to fear for his safety. Shane, how did you first come across this film?
It's one of those movies that had been on my hit list for years, having seen it in the video shop. You know, that kind of weird poster image of William Hurt.
Upside down William Hurt.
With like cathodes or whatever it is on his head, and it just was so strange and freaky that I wanted to see it, but I was too scared to watch it as a kid. And then I maybe picked it up like 10 years ago when I was in a pretty sad state and smoking loads of weed, and just sat down to watch it on my laptop, and was actually like really blown away. You know, I was pretty stoned as well, so I think maybe I was really receptive to some of the some of the imagery in it. But yeah, really, I've seen it a couple of times since, and you know, it's a really interesting and really well executed piece of work. I really like it.
I kind of grew up with it. I don't know, did you see any coverage of it when it came out?
No, nothing. It's
So-
literally that kind of clamshell VHS.
Yeah, big black
haunting.
Warner Brothers clamshell.
Yeah, haunting the video shop.
I remember it coming out because I was a sci-fi movie whore in the late 70s, early 80s. Everything that came along I was kind of interested in. And
Perfect era for it. Wasn't
yeah,
it?
there was lots of coverage in science fiction magazines, and there were loads of I know people complain about spoilers these days, but back in those days, like, film companies were releasing images of all the spoiler
Yeah.
section, everything from every film, everything from American Wolf in London, everything from Altered States. Like, the stuff that I saw from Altered States in an issue of Starlog was what kind of like piqued my curiosity, because it had all the kind of distorted bodily shapes,
Oh yeah, all the Dick Smith stuff.
all the special effects shots and everything in it. So I was kind of interested in it then, but obviously I was only 9, 10 years old.
Yeah.
So I got to see it a few years later. It must have been 82 or 83. We didn't have a VCR, so we had to rent it from the video shop and watch it on my friend's VCR. And it didn't disappoint. I was really blown away by it. And then kind of in later years had like an ex-rental copy of it on tape and got it on DVD when that came out, which was probably my most revelatory viewing of it in widescreen for the first time in really decent sound and everything. And I've seen it theatrically once,
Oh, okay.
but it was terrible. The NFT had a science fiction season at the end of 2014, and they were showing this. So, you know, my wife and I went along, and I was very, very excited to see it on a big screen. But then at the beginning of the screening, they said, "Oh, it's a very old print, and unfortunately, it's a bit faded." So it was falling apart, and it was basically just pink all the way through. And you know, at least half of this film is the incredibly varied and colourful visuals.
Yeah.
So that was a waste of time. And the Blu-ray as well is quite disappointing because they've gone for a contemporary grade on it, and they've colour timed a lot of the saturation out of it. So if anyone was going to be watching it on Blu-ray, I'd suggest you just turn up the colour on your TV by about 25% to get it back to something like it should look. So I've kind of grown up with it. But oddly enough, when I was doing my drug experimentation years in my early 20s, I didn't involve it in that at all.
Oh, yeah.
It's never been a druggy movie for me.
I just think it really stands up, and I think, you know, there's all these stories about the sort of muddled history of the production, and it's switching studios and losing Arthur Penn, and you know, Ken Russell and Chayefsky fighting on set. They call it a clash of two monstrous egos, having both of them on set at the same time. But I don't feel any of that in the film, actually. I feel like it's kind of...
It's really strange, isn't it? It feels like a whole piece.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like a muddied mishmash of all sorts of things.
It's not fragmented at all. You
No.
know, maybe a little abrupt at the ending, but you know, apart from that, I find it really convincing.
We should talk about that now, because half of the film's reputation when it came out was how difficult a production it had. And there's things about it that I only found out this morning. I didn't realise it was Paddy Chevsky's last film.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Because this is only novel as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. It's his novel that he started writing immediately after the success of Network,
Yeah.
and he was apparently extremely stressed during the writing of it and had a heart attack.
Oh my god.
So, you know,
Stressed? I don't know, because when you watch the film and you listen to the dialogue and some of the pseudo scientific exploration they're talking about, it just sounds like cocaine, doesn't it? Sounds like the cocaine talking, because a lot of the parapsychology and the science is pretty redundant these days. We've sort of left that stuff behind, haven't
yeah,
we? So
pseudoscience, yeah.
pseudo, yeah.
Well, a lot of that stuff would have come, John C. Lilly, who was a psychologist. He's the guy whose research a lot
Yeah,
of the
the
book was
altered
based on.
states of perception. That's his phrase.
And it was a lot of his research into, obviously, psychedelic drug use and isolation tanks and where that leads, that fed into the novel. But yeah, and Chevsky was very stressed, had a heart attack during the writing of it, and I think knowing that was probably the novel was kind of his inquiry into mortality and life after death
Yeah,
and
it's his existential moment,
yeah,
isn't
it's
it?
this very existential moment, which kind of explains why he's so tied to the novel and tied to the project. Because when the film was made, he was effectively the source of a lot of conflict on the production with
He was there
everyone.
through all the development, wasn't
Yeah, the development was quite interesting because Columbia actually paid all the key participants, including the production designer, the then effects supervisor, Dick Smith, the makeup effects supervisor, director and writer. They actually paid for them for the
he?
development.
Yeah,
They'd
they're
all
just
sit down
brainstorming, aren't they? Days and days and weeks and months of
and
sketching
uh,
and talking.
yeah, and but never really reaching any conclusion on how they're going to do a lot of stuff. And Dick Smith, in that fabulous article in Cinefex, seemed to sort of take command and say, right, well, we have to do something, so I'm going to build these
Yeah,
suits,
yeah.
and
And
we'll
this is
work
how we
around
do it
that.
practically.
Yeah. But Chevsky seemed to be the guy who was, I mean, again, it's something I read about him this morning. He was a very antagonistic person. He just loved to argue and would often change sides just because he enjoyed
Oh, okay.
the heat of the fight. And there was a report in the Cinefex, I think it was one of the effects guys was, would you get into a conversation with him and Chevsky would say, no, that isn't what I want. And somebody would say to him, well, what do you want? And he'd say, well, don't ask me, I'm just the writer. So I can imagine that would be quite maddening.
Yeah.
Pre-production got too expensive. Columbia dropped the project. It went to Warner's. Arthur Penn dropped out after a disagreement with Chevsky. Production moved ahead. Ken Russell came on board.
I mean, he came on board, 3 months before they started shooting, so they've had I don't know, a year or 2 years in development.
Yeah.
And then they just grabbed Ken Russell at the last minute. And to be fair, he comes in and puts his stamp on it. You can feel it's a Ken Russell film.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the thing: in that Cinefex article, it's kind of very dismissive of everything that Ken Russell did, as if he kind of just salvaged it from all the parts that everyone left lying around.
Sure.
But he did order all the sets torn down to start from scratch so that he could do it his way.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it is a Ken Russell film, and a lot of the ideas that he brought to it to actually solve story problems that 2 years of development had not got anywhere near, solve the story problems
Yeah,
and
that's it.
really make it work.
Yeah, yeah.
At the end of the film, the lead character Jessup is dissolving away into nothing, and he infects his wife with the same dissolution, and she starts to kind of dissolve as
Yeah,
well.
she breaks down into that fabulous lava
Lava
bodysuit.
suit. But they spent ages in development saying, how are we going to express the fact that he's passed this on to her? We can't make it too obvious. We can't make it too obscure. And Ken Russell just solves that by saying, well, we'll just have a shot of his hand touching hers,
Yeah, yeah.
and then she starts to transform. And it's just the simple things like that that actually solved a lot of the
I think
problems.
he was the one that had set up in the second act. She reaches into the void, into the abyss as well, doesn't she? Which is like sowing the seeds in her DNA for that breakdown as well. So it's set up and then paid off.
And of course, yeah, I didn't mention Chevsky left the project as soon
Ken
as
Russell ordered him off set, didn't he? In the end, he was just like, he's too disruptive.
yeah, but he absolutely was disruptive. There's a story of one of the production designers says, Chevsky would wander on set and order them to start tearing down sets because they weren't
Yeah, yeah.
what he imagined.
Yeah,
And
had them remove windows from townhouse sets and all sorts, didn't he?
So Chevsky left, took his name off the project, just used a pseudonym.
Pseudonym, isn't it his middle name or something?
His middle name and his actual first name, Sidney Aaron.
That's it, Sidney Aaron. Yeah.
And then, unfortunately, died a year later of cancer.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, I just thought he was still going.
So I can kind of see his motivation for hanging on to this project,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
his statement about life and death,
Oh,
when he clearly knew that he was near the
yeah. So you
end.
think he was diagnosed?
I think so, yeah.
So that's why mortality is in the forefront of everything that he's doing and experimentation and
Yeah.
wow.
So you can see, he was very disruptive, but you can also see why he wanted absolute control of this
Sure.
project.
So do you know much about Paddy Chayefsky? I know him from Network, but not much else.
I know his background from TV. He wrote Marty, which was one of
Oh,
the
okay. Ernest
ground.
Borgnine.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
he wrote the TV version and the film adaptation.
Uh-huh.
Was one of those kind of heavyweight TV writers that moved into film.
Yeah.
I think kind of his peak years were throughout the 60s and 70s, obviously,
Mhm.
and then massive success of Network. But that was, Network, and then this movie were effectively the end of his career.
Wow.
Well, the end of his life.
End
but,
of his life, yeah.
Again, this is legitimately a Ken Russell movie. It's
Oh, no
interesting
doubt.
to think, yeah.
There's stuff in the Cinefex article where they talk about him being able to compress all of those themes into, where in the script and in the development process up to that point, they'd had sequences that would be 50 shots trying to
Yeah, taken,
grasp a religious,
laboriously
sexual,
taken straight
exactly.
from the novel.
And he was able to just compress those into a single or images or a shortened sequence that was kind of visually breathtaking, really immediate. And I think he was pushing for frame cutting and making it more kind of dynamic visually and trying to impress on the subconscious.
I think he had the first time I've noticed watching it this time round. I noticed Stuart Baird's name in the credits.
Oh yeah, okay.
As an executive producer,
Mhm.
and Stuart Baird is the absolute
editor,
genius editor,
Yeah.
who was the fix-it man for Warner Brothers throughout the
okay.
90s, and he'd worked with Ken Russell on a couple of movies in the 70s,
Oh really?
and by that point he'd cut The Omen and Superman.
Yeah.
And Superman was quite a fraught production, and he kind of brought that together breathtakingly.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was kind of Ken Russell's right-hand man, creative
okay.
consultant on that, because he's got that talent for pulling together the best of a very, very difficult production and getting the best out of it. I think there's a bit of Stuart Baird's DNA in the movie.
Oh yeah, okay.
But
At first glance, it feels like a strange film for Ken Russell. An American science fiction film after he's coming off Valentino and is it Listomania?
Yeah,
and
Tommy a
Devils?
few years
yeah,
before.
exactly. He was kind of doing big showy musicals, and then his subsequent work is all kind of a little bit more exploitative.
Yeah, exploitation and horror, isn't it? A lot throughout
so
the
it
80s.
seems like an odd choice, but then on second pass, you kind of see the stuff about faith and belief in your choices. William Hurt's character, like pushing hard to dig into this religious experience of regressing into a primitive state. It is actually perfect Ken Russell material, and you kind of wish he'd done more films with this sort of budget and freedom. I think this is almost the pinnacle, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
And I think it feels like he was quite loose with his thinking around the visual effects, to go from what they had and to just acknowledge it's not good enough, and to find
someone and something
groundbreaking techniques to really twist the visuals into something actually quite spectacular and really, really special. So do you know, have you found anything about what Ken Russell thought or felt about the film?
I'm sure there's a lot of stuff out there, because Ken Russell has quite a big cult following, and I'm sure there's a lot of writing about it. But the only thing that I've found is, frustratingly, there's an article from the week it was released in America, is reproduced on the New York Times archive, but unfortunately a few paragraphs in it just it's mistranscribed, and it switches over to an article about Rachel Tickerton, the actress. But from what he says in that article, he was, and it's clear from watching the film and reading the book. You've read the book as well, haven't you? Yeah. From reading the book, it is a very, very faithful adaptation of the book.
Yeah, they say that, don't they? I think there's a point in that Cinefex article maybe where they're talking about how loyal they were to Chayefsky's dialogue and making sure that the characters spoke as he wanted them to.
Yeah.
But they moved some of the scenes to sort of crowded rooms and got them all talking simultaneously just to try and compress it. Because ultimately you don't need to know all of the cod science to get it. You just need to feel that their belief and faith in what they're doing and their energy and
Yeah,
enthusiasm
and
for it.
the sense that they're brilliant and knowledgeable enough that what they're saying is
That's it.
probably
Dynamic young
yeah.
minds pushing the boundaries of science and human experience.
Russell says that even if he'd wanted to, there wasn't really any way that he could actually change a word of the script because Chevsky would have sued him.
Oh yeah. Okay.
He was that possessive about it. He seems thoroughly gentlemanly about it and say, I did a good job. I adapted it very very faithfully, organised the visual elements so that they work,
Mm-hmm.
which is absolutely true.
Yeah, yeah.
So how does the movie affect you? Because it's a very powerful film.
I think it's a really inspiring film. It's really well crafted. I really like the performances. I love how much they believe in what they're doing. I think the science feels a bit dated now. We've kind of left a lot of those ideas far behind, this idea that we can reach back into some memory buried in our DNA over centuries and millennia. I think
Yeah, it's kind of
it's a bit silly.
it's the inverted commas science of the time.
Yeah, that's it. If you know anybody now that's kind of like still a drug addict, that's the kind of nonsense they talk about. I really love the effects work in it. It has so many little indulgences, which I think it's hard for modern films to get away with. I love all the stuff with the primordial man running around the city, all that stuff that's shot on a back lot. 5 or 10 minutes of a little ape man running around being chased by dogs and then going to the zoo. And I just love those interludes. I feel like it's really, really brave to do those kind of things. I love it that it just has like a time jump between the first and second act of like 7 or 8
years, yeah.
seven,
And if you're not listening carefully to the dialogue, it's
it's easy
that.
to miss. It's easy to miss, and I think it's kind of, I don't know, it's very respectful of the audience. It's never patronizing. It says that the characters accept this reality, so
that's a really important point for me, is that it doesn't piss about in the way that so many films do. Say, is it real? Isn't it real? Is this really happening, or is it hallucination? It has hallucinatory scenes early on, and then it very, very clearly accepts that this is physically happening, and so do the characters.
Yeah, that there is. I don't know. Do you ever see that movie Somewhere in Time, where Christopher Reeve magics himself back in time, and it has that sort of absolutism to its core. Like this can happen. We believe in this.
Well, that for me is what makes a supernatural or a fantastic film genuinely inspiring or worth watching. I have no time for those films, and it's such a cliche. Those films that kind of want their cake and eat it. It's kind of like, oh well, we're going to show you these fantastic things, but we have to, for the sake of balance, inspire doubt. Is this really happening? Is this idea too crazy? You have to take a crazy idea and go with it. That's what fantasy fiction and film is. And if you don't go with it, then I'm not going with your movie.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, you feel that when people are sitting on the fence and worried about looking silly, that they definitely come back from the abyss, don't they? Whereas this film leaps in. You have at one point William Hurt like reduced to a primordial blob, and at some point he's completely atomized. And it's all just part of this experimental process that he's gone through. It's like the combination of the isolation chamber and the psychotropic drugs is enough to somehow unlock his DNA so that he can reconstitute into some ancient
ancient form of his own energy.
No, it's fascinating stuff, and what I liked about it was its conviction to its ideas, and then you had your...
I have something to say.
You have something to say.
I find it, I agree with every single word that you've said. I find it brilliant on a technical level and really engrossing.
Especially because they were still winging it at the end, to some of those visual effects they made up after the film was cut and finished, and they were just unhappy with...
It wasn't quite big enough at the end, was it? I agree with all of that. I just, on a personal level, I find it a genuinely frightening film. I find it unsettling. I find the central concept, the fact that by some combination of means you can unlock the fabric of reality. I find that quite disturbing. Anything that can unlock the fabric of reality is obviously quite disturbing to me.
Sure.
But I do find it really unsettling, the fact that that happens to the lead
Yeah,
character.
yeah. And it's actually relatively simple. It's a simple cocktail, isn't it?
Mm.
Like an exotic drug, an isolation chamber, and
Mm.
that's it, you know.
It's the idea that a couple of random or semi-random things brought together can bring it
Oh,
about.
okay. There's a chance it might happen accidentally.
Yeah. So I find anything like that really frightening, and there's some things in it which I want to highlight. Again, this is Ken Russell, absolutely, because it's not things that are in the script, and it's not special effects images. There's a couple of images and moments in it which I find extremely frightening
Hmm.
and extremely vivid and powerful. There's an early scene where Jessup, the lead character, has just met Emily, his wife to be,
Yeah.
and they go back to her apartment and they're having sex.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is like really early on as well,
Yeah,
isn't it? I mean, it
and
kicks into gear
and
straight
it's
away.
you don't see his hallucinations or the things that he's seeing whilst they're having sex, but he's having internal visions.
Hmm.
Um, and then you cut to an electric fire, just an orange electric
Yeah,
fire
yeah, yeah.
in close up, and with the soundtrack underneath, which we'll talk about later. I just find that an extremely disturbing image.
Hmm.
It's just everyday life made to seem extremely unsettling just because of the
Yeah,
moment.
but his performance, I mean, again, something, it's his first movie, and he is electric in it. You
Yeah.
know, he's able to sort of have that slightly autistic, academic distance from everybody around him, but also having this like deep spiritual
Mm.
journey simultaneously. It's a really complicated performance that he pulls off. You know,
Yeah.
there's no exaggeration. He's always there. That scene where he's having sex, you just see like in his eyes, like he's gone. You know,
Mm.
his body's in one place and his mind is completely elsewhere. His wife describes sex with him as being harpooned by a monk receiving God, which I thought was a really nice line.
It's images like the electric fire. There's a couple of, I mean, the symbolism's very obvious on them. The scenes framing him in doorways.
Hmm.
There's the scene where Emily sees him for the first
Yeah,
time
when he
at
arrives
the
at
end
the
of,
party.
and I checked out the geography of the corridor that he's at
Mhm.
the end of, and Emily in relation to it, and it's massively exaggerated in the shot
Yeah, of course.
where the door opens and he's kind of haloed in this white
Yeah,
light
yeah,
from
yeah.
outside. He just looks like this messianic figure in
Yeah,
the
that's it.
distance.
Mm.
That's an amazing image. And the scene, kind of with the schizophrenic, who is
Yeah, yeah.
really strange scene.
Yeah, so that's the scene where, because his work is exploring the minds of schizophrenics and their sort of parallel religious experiences, and he himself had a semi-religious experience as a child, which is, I think, where his fascination comes from. But that scene, there's a schizophrenic being poked and prodded and
And-
analysed by a team of doctors behind one-way glass.
Tested with psychotropic drugs.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's just sat on the other side of it having quite a sort of mundane,
Domestic
with
chat with his wife to be.
yeah, and she's talking about them getting married and you know how what a benefit it would be to their stability and things. And in the meantime, just see this girl on the monitor, and then behind the glass, just kind of rolling her eyes and starting to really phase out. It's
Slightly possessed look, isn't it?
but none of the sort of big physical gestures that you'd expect from a movie like this. You know, it's very contained, and very interior, I suppose.
And she has that line, when she's been injected, and I think the drug calms her.
Hmm.
I feel like my heart has been touched by Christ.
Yeah.
It's just a really unsettling moment, which is not, it's not a major part of the film, but it just kind of sets the mood.
Mm-mm. I really like the opening sequence where we're looking into the isolation chamber window, and then we sort of pull back from there to Bob Balaban in the lab.
Yeah.
I really like that. There's a thing, are you going to say the same thing about in the Cinefex where I think that was Ken Russell's idea, wasn't it, to put a window in it so we could see inside?
It's only when you think about it afterwards, and this is
an isolation chamber with a window.
with a window.
Yeah.
It's a measure of how the film sells itself to you. It's just it's such a powerful opening that you don't really consider that, do you?
It's a lovely picture, yeah. And then I really like that title sequence with the letters just scrolling left to right and right to left, and then
Overlaying and then
yeah.
revealing themselves. Yeah.
It's really nice.
Yeah, it's title sequence by Robert Greenberg. It's R. Greenberg Associates anyway. I think it was only their second or third title sequence.
It's really nice.
They came from an advertising background, and Ridley Scott got them in as visual consultants on Alien, and they
Oh,
did
okay.
the credit sequence for that.
Oh, really? Oh, it's very similar, isn't it?
And also Superman the movie. I think that was their first credit
Oh,
sequence,
wow. Okay.
which was, to this day, is one of the best credit sequences ever.
What I really liked was that how quickly it gets into the film and gets into the meat of what it's about, and how dynamic it is with establishing the characters and then like just pushing forwards. You know,
It's really concise, isn't it?
doesn't waste any time at all. A really interesting lesson in storytelling.
And setting up your visual schematics as well. You know, it opens with isolation tank in a in a kind of basement set.
Yeah, yeah.
You set up the lighting schemes that you're going to have for later in the film,
Mm-mm.
all that sort of thing, whilst you're introducing the lead character's obsessions.
But there's something about the joy that they have as well about doing the work. So, you know, it is kind of dark and scary and, you know, abstract concepts. But there's just an absolute pleasure that they're having in the exploration as well, which I think is really tangible.
Something they're doing in their free time, just for interest's sake, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, taking drugs and experimenting with isolation.
Well, the drugs don't come into it until, I mean, to be fair, there's no drugs in it until
Till Mexico.
till Mexico.
Yeah, that's
it's
true.
purely isolation tank.
And so that happens 7 years later, right? So he still has this memory of being in the isolation chamber and what it was unlocking.
Yeah, because the first time that he uses the tank, he talks about hallucinating, but we never see it. We never go into those kind of interior visions.
And then we're about 13 minutes into the film when he has his second dip into the isolation chamber, and that's when he has his first visions. That's when his friend Arthur is asleep at the controls.
And it's not that he has his first hallucinations, it's the first time that we see them.
First time, yeah, we as the audience
And
see inside of his mind. Yeah, that's good.
And we see his kind of startling religious imagery.
That first set of hallucinations is pretty dense. You get the seven-eyed goat figure on a crucifix. You get those Dali-esque landscapes. You get sex, violence, sacrifice, Catholicism. It's all kind of there in like that first, and it really just thunders past, and then you're kind of out again. There's that seven-eyed goat-headed man on a crucifix, which is it's a really powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of work apparently went into making that. You know, they were trying very hard to make sure the eyes, all seven eyes, looked as if they were staring right at you.
Yeah, it works. I mean, it's really haunting.
But even within these sort of hallucination images that aren't tied into the sort of central regression, they're not as a result of. There's still a lot of.
Well, he's got to unlock his subconscious before he can regress. Right?
Yeah, but there's still a lot of imagery in there about unlocking forbidden truths. There's the shot of what looks like a huge religious book, if it's a Bible or a.
Yeah.
And as you open that, you get a sudden explosion of, you know, you feel that this is forbidden knowledge that he's reaching into here. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much the film kind of plays him as a messianic figure who is always destined to do what he does, or if that's just kind of part of his religious imagery. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, what if he'd have been raised an atheist? Would he have been able to still journey as far?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, almost having a big symbol in your mind from childhood gives you something to push back against.
Yeah.
One scene which I really liked, which isn't really to do with the science, but it was just a nice way of filling in after the sort of 7-year time jump. You have Bob Balaban's character and his wife turn up, and she's pregnant, and they're just sort of moving between the rooms of this house, gossiping, and it was just a really nice way of, you know, you see the family one way, and then the wives have been gossiping, and actually the family is something else, and they're going to have some time apart. The wife's going to go and do some research work in Africa, and Jessup's going to stay there on his own, and she's going to take the children, and you know, Paul Balaban's completely oblivious, isn't he? He's just like, what's happening? I just thought that was a really nice way of getting the information across, and you sort of, you know, the gossiping wife, you know, there's definitely a glee to her.
Yeah, it's gossip, isn't it?
Yeah, and she's really enjoying it, and you're drawn quite quickly into that. You don't just think, oh, exposition disguised as dialogue.
Yeah,
there's lots of those little clever details.
Yeah, after 7 years, they've settled down and they're both pursuing their very kind of successful academic careers,
Mm.
quite wealthy as well, I would imagine.
Yeah,
Somebody hints
yeah.
at in one line of dialogue.
Well, they've got a nice house. They've moved to San Francisco, and they've got a lovely house in San Francisco, and yeah, they seem to be doing all right for themselves in the upper leagues of academia. A friend of his says, you've got everything. And he's like, no, I've got nothing. All of these trappings.
Yeah, you have one of the most brilliant women in the world who adores you. If anyone has it made, it's you.
Yeah.
And his response, which I made a note of, is Jessup has absolutely. He's still obsessed with getting back to his quest, which he doesn't quite know what it is, but he knows that day-to-day life is holding him back. And he says, if I don't strip myself of all this clatter and ridiculous ritual, I shall go out of my fucking mind, which is kind of your lead character right there.
Yeah.
And within the same scene as well, you kind of get the first hook of the South American experience, where
That's it. Combining isolation chambers with
psychotropic drugs, and introducing the character of Eduardo, who's a colleague of theirs at the faculty, who they go to dinner with that evening.
Really nice scene again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really bustling cafe. They're all in different stages of inebriation, and
It's
it's
lovely,
really spiky, isn't it?
yeah. It's one of those things because I saw it so young. I still see that like restaurant stroke bodega stroke shop and think I really want to eat somewhere like that, and I've never found anywhere like that in
I
life.
wish I had friends that I could go to a cafe with. And
Yes, it's a fantastic scene, which again could be, an absolute rattletrap of exposition, but everyone is drunk and racing through their different ideas and their responses to Jessup's.
And you can see that the booze has made Jessup quite loose as well, where normally he's quite uptight, so
Yeah.
it's a nice sort of drunk scene as well.
And it carefully kind of introduces a tone of menace and an uncertainty about where Jessup's obsessions are going to lead, just by pushing in closer and watching Emily's reactions to him as he gets.
That's it, because I think it's quite good at keeping Emily safe from him and saying that she's an intellectual in her own right, and her ideas and research are as valid as his. She's just not as showy, and ultimately that threads back in when she returns from Africa, and her work is paralleled with his, and then she's able to save him.
About Emily, as there's another review I was reading this morning, is volume 2 of Cult Movies.
Oh yeah.
Those two books, Cult Movies, were written just before the advent of home video.
Oh, okay. Wow.
So cult movies in those days meant movies that people would go and see in the cinema over and over again.
Yeah, track down.
And at the end of volume 1, he mentions Altered States as one of the movies that was growing in prominence at the time of writing. And then he does it in volume 2. But one of the things he says about Emily is he points out how her characterization is strengthened compared to the novel.
Oh, okay.
Novel has a section where she tries to live without him early in their relationship and then goes back to him because she's obsessed by him. So the movie excises that, and it also kind of strengthens her career, as you say. It gives her, an independent career. She's brilliant in her own right.
And she's a mother as well. She's raising the kids as well as doing all of her work. It's she's doing two jobs basically, where he's just kind of indulging himself with a hobby.
And again, immediately after the scientific discussion in the bodega, we are straight away cut to Mexico.
Nice introduction scene where you sort of pan across the landscape, and you know that you've gone from San Francisco to somewhere quite different. And as the pan finishes, their hands appear and they're climbing up the rocks into shot. I think that's just a really economic way of doing everything in one shot. It's really nice.
So he's here to try this, the Hinchi Indians' ancient psychedelic potion, which evokes a common experience in everyone who takes it, which is, very unusual, obviously. And he wants to feel that kind of primal experience because he thinks it's something akin to what he's chasing.
He's nervous as well, isn't he? Like, he's, for the first time we see him asking, like, really, what am I going to see? What can I expect? Like he's really nervous, but
nervous
trying
and excited.
to be academic about it at the same time.
So there's quite a lot to unpack in this scene, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, there's the ritual itself. There's the beautiful images of tribespeople picking mushrooms from the side of the mountain as they come skipping down the rocks past them to catch up with the shaman. There's the images from the hallucination itself.
You have to look quite hard into the script to find like I wouldn't call it a MacGuffin, but there is a magic potion in there.
Yeah,
There is
yeah.
like the one fantastic element in it is the hallucinogen that the Indians use,
Mm.
which evokes a common experience, and that's the fantastic element that's hidden so carefully in the plot
Yeah.
that you just kind of accept it on at face value.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
not asked to
But
make a massive leap.
it's not a complete fabrication either. You know, there are tribes that, you know, across South America and Africa that are still ingesting, you know, unknown roots of unknown, you know, genetic composition
Mm.
and having visions and vision quests. You know, it's that, you know, you see Bruce Parry in the Amazon off his nuts, you know,
Mm.
and so I think it's not a big leap to accept that.
Sure, but it's the idea that it evokes this common experience in everyone who
Mm.
takes it. That's the
Yeah,
Dr.
but there's
Jekyll
that.
thing.
Yeah, and the combination of his own experiments with the isolation chamber is the extra catalyst,
Mm.
I think. I love that scene with the Indians, actually. I think that's a really nice sequence. There's that brilliant bit where they're talking to the Indian and he just turns and walks away. And then when they go to catch him up, he's like 100 meters away. So they have to run all the way down the hill to catch him. And I think they were saying something like, you know, there's the belief that these shaman are light of foot. You know, when you see Crouching Tiger or something, and those people are able to just skip across the trees. You know,
Mm.
I think there was a little hint of that, but there's no way to show it without it looking ridiculous. But then they just have to sprint down to catch him up. I thought that was a really nice detail.
I like that scene as well. It's a nice sort of subtle horror movie undertow of menace in the scene. There's
Mm.
just little things like, is it Eduardo, the
Yeah,
South American character who
yeah,
they introduce, who always looks slightly removed from the action and as if he's not quite to be trusted.
mm.
He's always kind of at a remove, and he's always not quite involved in the action. And
But I think his character is supposed to represent this. You know, the gatekeeper. You know, he's the man that walks between two cultures. You
yeah,
know, the sophisticated scientists of the West and the primitive shaman of the South. Would you say? Yeah,
South America, yeah.
yeah, South America. So I think, you know, he has a foot in both worlds.
Mm.
He's the gatekeeper, isn't he? He can get them access to the good stuff.
And there's the actual, I mean, I wouldn't call it hokey because I've got too much respect for the film, but it does sort of play with a slight kind of horror movie. Can you trust these tribes people? Are they dangerous? You know, is it going to be a physical danger
Mm.
to Jessup? And there is, you know, as part of the ceremony, they do grab his hand against his will and
Slice the web with
slice his hand
finger,
open
don't they?
to squeeze blood into the potion.
Yeah, they do look a bit sinister. There's a few kind of like sinister smiles and laughs as
Yeah,
well, isn't there?
and leers between one another,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, it kind of it's just spice for a horror
Yeah,
movie.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, it definitely serves to unnerve.
And fantastic bit of music
Mm.
here. Um,
And the sound effects as well.
mm,
It's kind of really stuff that makes your heart leap.
yeah, music's by John Corigliano, who was and is a very well respected semi avant garde composer.
Yeah, he doesn't have many credits, does he?
No, I think he's gotten not many movie commissions, and he's been shafted a couple of times. Apparently, he was recently hired to do a score for the Mel Gibson version of Edge of Darkness, but it got rejected. But yeah, the music in the entire Mexico hallucination scene is phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of feels like diegetic music, like the music of the Mexican tribes people and their sort of horns, but then you realise it's actually part of the score and it's leading into some really remarkably loud music.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult to know how to approach this whole section, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, he takes the potion, he hallucinates.
He has the common hallucination,
Yeah,
but his hallucination does seem to be influenced a lot more by his personal life as well.
yeah, that's it, that's it. He has a mad vision, which is sort of the parallels between man and life. You have that sort of strange sequence where they're in, you know, he's wearing a boater and they're under a parasol
Yeah.
looking out at the landscape, and then their clothes switch from white to red, and it's all, you know, very impressionistic. And then there's just the stuff of lizards and, you know, cell structures imploding and that kind of stuff.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think my interpretation of it is that this is his first experience with the drug, and he gets a glimpse of, because we see glimpses and flashes of hallucinatory stuff of what you might call physics and biology.
Mm.
We get sort of very quick glimpses of that, and so does he. and he gets a taste of
So it's about
what's to come.
potential more than.
But you also get the scenes of his, which are kind of metaphors for his relationship and how he feels that
Yeah.
everyday life, as you say, is crushing him and strangling him. Um,
There's that scene where he has a vision of a lizard, like a Komodo dragon or something, a
mm,
large lizard, and it lifts its head, and then it cuts to his wife
to Emily,
naked
yeah,
in a sphinx-like position, and then he lays down and looks at her as they turn to sand and then slowly
dissolve in
in
the
the
wind,
wind.
yeah,
Yeah, and considering how quick the sequence is up to that point, it just again stops, and the audience just sit there and watch
yeah.
them.
The music stops,
Yeah,
and you just watch it almost in real
yeah,
time as
it
they
feels like a couple of
erode.
minutes suddenly, and very hypnotic as they just erode in the wind.
It's
But
interesting. I've only just realised that you could read that dissolution as what's destined to happen to them later in the film,
breaking down to the
breaking down into
composite, elements. Yeah, but I think it's also about him acknowledging that he needs some time alone, essentially, because then when he comes out of his hallucination, there's again quite a few uh, narrative points that are quickly thrown at you. First is that he's killed the lizard, which I think the tribes people are pretty pissed off about.
yeah,
That's why they have to leave in a
in a
hurry.
hurry.
But they've also let him take some of the potion, and
Mm.
he's going to synthesize it. So he's seen the potential for it to help him on his quest, and
Mm.
he's basically nabbed it and will synthesize it, and he's got what he needs. So then they're back in the lab, and we're straight into another vision, another hallucination, where they use clips from Dante's Inferno,
Mm.
which actually looks really harrowing, doesn't it? It looks like Gustave Doré or Hieronymus Bosch. It looks like that, and it's been done, physically by. I wish I'd done a bit more research, but some filmmaker in the 20s or 30s. It looks stunning. So they've just incorporated that. Why bother trying to recreate it when somebody's done such a great job already
Mm.
into his visions of hell? He's going deeper.
Yeah, I used to find it a bit odd that we're still in his religious iconography and his kind of Christian iconography at
Mm.
this stage when he's starting to experiment with the drugs and he should be pushing more.
Yeah,
But
he's
again,
pushing through it, isn't he?
yeah, but again, it's still there and it's still lingering and it's something he has to push through in order to
Yeah,
find
yeah.
what's really
I mean,
waiting.
there's an argument that religious thinking is designed to be a barrier to progressive thought. That
Mm.
we can't find our true place in the wider universe without first of all casting off these fables that shackle us
Mm.
to a very limited thought process. So I think it's a hard push through for him to get past. When we get back to the States, Mason really joins the story. We've seen him on the peripheries, but now he's kind of we get to see his character. He's the kind of, you have your two committed scientists, then you have the contrary voice, and he's really good at like shouting and
Shouting down.
storming, and you're just like, I'm not listening to this shit any longer. He
But
does that all the way throughout.
I think Mason just wants a quiet life more than anything. He's pretty happy with the real world.
Yeah, but he believes in their work
Oh, he absolutely believes in their work,
and
and
their
it's
conviction, but he doesn't want to believe it once. I think the first sequence we get Eddie talking about proto-humans, and where he's tripping his nuts off in the isolation chamber for the first time, talking about walking along. I'm with them. I'm hunting with the proto-humans, and
But it's quite interesting the way that scene is filmed. You kind of cut from the hallucinations
hmm,
to a very very objective, very exterior view. You're sitting with Mason and Arthur in a very plain, sterile room, looking at Eddie through an observation window.
yeah,
And I think that's a really important way to introduce Mason and his kind of skepticism, because
mm-hmm.
at this stage it's fair to be skeptical about it, I think. And what Mason is
Yeah,
saying, that's one of the things I like him about him, is he is kind of common sense. At the beginning, Eddie is shooting up with an untested drug.
yeah, yeah.
He's just tripping out in
Yeah,
a
he's saying you
room.
should be testing it on rats, and why are
Yeah,
you rushing into and it's not even actual research. It's just you guys doing it on the side of your work.
but as the film progresses, he's skeptical, but he's not ignorant,
Yeah, yeah,
and he's not bullishly ignorant. When he's seen physical evidence of what Eddie is describing, he's taken evidence and had it examined, and it is clear that what's happening is really
yeah,
happening.
yeah, yeah,
He shouts, but he's not shouting it down, and he attends the experiments and he takes part,
yeah. Hmm.
and he's not just you kind of your movie's token skeptic with whom the skeptical side
Yeah,
of the
he's still a
audience can side.
scientist, isn't he?
He is a
He stays
scientist.
with the learning
Yeah,
ultimately.
and it's one of the strengths of the movie. It sticks with its subject and it has faith in it,
Mm.
and Mason comes to have faith in it too.
Yeah, that's it. And the wife as well. She is skeptical, and she also comes to believe that
Mm.
the research is valid. Just a sidebar, Charles Hayde. Have you seen him in anything else?
I know he's in Hill Street Blues a lot. I've seen him playing kind of like dangerous rednecks in a couple of things.
He plays the sort of redneck cop in Nightbreed.
I've not seen that.
Oh, there's a new cut on its way. So 25 years later.
Mm.
But he's also a director. So he's gone on to direct episodes of NYPD Blue, CSI, ER, Sons of Anarchy, and Breaking Bad.
Excellent.
Yeah, good on him.
Yeah.
He's got a really nice presence, hasn't he?
Yeah.
He looks like quite a dude.
Yes.
So let's see. So the first journey into the isolation chamber with the Mexican drug results in, we hear Eddie starting to trip out, and he's talking about proto-humans and hunting alongside them and lava, and he's really tons of just fragments, and then he just starts grunting and groaning and definitely sounding more animalistic. And when they pull him out of the chamber, he's got blood around his mouth, but also he can't speak. He's able to gesture for pen and paper and writing down that he wants X-ray, do all the blood tests and X-ray my neck because he can't speak properly. So they take an X-ray of his neck, and there's a weird kind of sac inside of it. And Mason has this really nice sequence where he's like, I'm professor of science, I'm this, that, and the other. I do not accept this. So he's like, I'm going to take this X-ray upstairs and get somebody to look at it properly. And he shows the X-ray to somebody else, and he says, what's wrong with this man? And he's like, it's.
Says, I'm looking for something somewhat unusual.
Yeah, he's like, well, this is not a man. This is a fucking gorilla.
Just to backtrack slightly, for a director who's renowned and vilified, you might say, for his kind of erratic, flamboyant movies, the whole first trip in the isolation tank, that whole scene you've just described, is absolutely beautifully put together.
Yeah.
Horror movie stuff.
Yeah.
Everything is perfectly
Well,
paced.
is this the first time we really settle into that black isolation chamber with the sort of inky darkness of the water?
Yeah,
the fluid
underneath
around
the
him,
hospital, yeah.
the electrodes on his head, and this subterranean chamber with a chamber within a chamber, isn't it? It's really nicely done. And you have to, for some reason, it's all split levels, so you have to keep going up and down stairs to get in and out of places. It's all, pretty exciting.
Yeah, and everything about it though is, the build up of tension and fear, and then remarkably after that, once Eddie's out, the sympathy that you have with him. He desperately, urgently wants to communicate to them. We've got to work quickly. We've got to do, got to do tests quickly. Do this quickly. And you're thinking, yes, do it quickly. I want to see the proof, and it actually delivers the proof at the end, which is so satisfying
Definitely.
as a viewer.
Yeah, that's it. And you think he's just had this terrifying experience, and yet there's still that glee in knowing that the science is valid. You recognise another sidebar. The X-ray technician, the old doctor that they take the X-ray to. Do you recognise him?
No.
It's Commander Lassard from the Police Academy movies.
Luckily, I would like suggest film snobbery and say that I've not seen them, but I've only seen one of those.
You've only seen the first 6.
I saw like 3 because I was on a date and it was the only thing that was on at the cinema.
Okay. So the next sequence is Eddie at home. He's picked up a young student.
As a sidebar, this film is not terribly contemporary in its portrayal of teacher-student relations. They've all like, Mason has lots of dates with very young-looking women, and Eddie is quite happy to pick up his students.
Yeah, it definitely says academia is a world for sleazy intellectuals to get laid.
Yeah.
And this stuff, I'm not sure if the intention is that it's real, or if it's hallucinations, or somewhere in between.
I feel that it's real, but this is the only scene in the film where I think it's slightly clumsy in its fudging of reality.
Yeah, because we see his chest cavity collapsing and trying to reconfigure itself in a
Yeah,
more.
and his arms kind of swelling and
Yeah, that's it. They call it the mole, don't they? Beneath the skin.
mm,
I mean, beautiful effects, actually. Really good looking stuff.
yeah, great practical effects.
And then he sort of jumps in the shower to cool himself off, and his feet turn into ape feet
Yeah,
almost with his.
the way that he's kind of
But it's done in
looking.
the cuts, isn't it? So it's not like in American Werewolf where we get this long, agonizing transformation. It's sort of he looks his foot looks back and it's changed, and then looks and it's back to normal.
Yeah, this. I mean, I always interpret the scene as being real,
Mm.
but
But
it does
he
fudge
does
it.
open the door and see, lava.
It fudges it with doing that transformation in the cuts, whereas it could just be something he's imagining, and then also, as you say, he opens the doors, go back into the bedroom, and you get this amazing sort of vertigo shot,
Yeah.
looking down into a fiery pit of hell, which is obviously a hallucination. But
Mm.
I always take it as real. The next big sequence is makes me interpret what we've just seen as real.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the next sequence is him experimenting again and then fully regressing into, the proto-human
Mm.
ape man.
I really like that sequence. I feel it's slightly at odds with the cosmic nature of the rest of the film,
Mm.
but I can, as sort of like a self-contained.
Yeah, but it's nicely bizarre. It's a nice sort of bizarre tangent, a nice kind of
Mm.
sidestep from, intellectually interior and, literally interior sequences and scenes.
Mm.
To sort of break free of that and hit the streets is quite fun.
There's a shot in it which I'll always remember from seeing the trailer. Back in the early 80s, you didn't used to have to show trailers appropriate to the film they were supporting.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So you could go and see Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, and you'd see a trailer for Outland
Oh,
or
yeah.
something, or you could go and see Flash Gordon, and you'd
Mm.
have an Altered States trailer attached to
Yeah.
it, which wouldn't be gruesome, but it would be quite scary.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's the image of Primate Eddie running down the road with the dogs following him,
Mm.
just with the sort of bathed in that sort of cold moonlight
Yeah, yeah.
with the rain. I just remember that image really clearly from seeing the trailer.
It's a nice performance as well. I can't remember the name of the guy that is playing the primordial man.
Miguel something? He's a
Yeah,
dancer, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. He's a Mexican dancer, and he has a really nice physicality, doesn't he?
Mm.
He gets the kind of animalistic parts, but there's also just like absolute physical confidence as he
Mm.
leaps from ladders to tops of cars. And there's a really cool scene with him and the elephants. I think it's supposed to be Boston Zoo. Is that right? Cause
Yeah, they're in Massachusetts, I think, Cambridge,
yeah,
Massachusetts.
yeah.
So.
But they shot it in the Bronx Zoo. I think it's one of the only films that's ever shot in the Bronx Zoo. And basically, the elephants were quite sedate, so they got the elephants really riled up, and then got him to run through the middle of them. And after that, he just threw a tantrum. Was like, "No more. That's the last take." Yeah. So you can see him like pushing them and then almost trampling him, and he's kind of just in there amongst them, trying to feed at the watering hole. It's a really nice sequence.
And again, this is like a really nicely shot, really nicely planned and executed sequence, which coming from a director who's kind of again vilified for being over the top and silly, and it's just
It's fantastic. I mean, but he is a great director, Ken Russell. I mean, I haven't seen that much of his work. When you look at how many films he actually knocked out, he was pretty busy. But The Devils, I think, is really meticulous in its execution. Tommy disturbed me as a kid, and I still have trouble watching it now.
I wanted to see Tommy a lot. I mean, when it came out, I was about 4 or 5 or something. But I remember there was loads of clips of it on TV.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember I wanted to see it really badly just because I was like jazzed by that clip. I think it's like a superimposed bit of Roger Daltrey running on lava or something.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And I wanted to see it so badly. And then I was really annoyed because there was a Jim Will Fix It where somebody else, like some other kid, wanted to see it.
Oh, yeah.
And they'd like cut together a safe version for him or her to
Oh,
see.
okay. It could have been you with Jimmy Savile.
Dodged a bullet there.
Yeah, that's it. That kid's probably still traumatized, poor bastard. What other Ken Russell movies have you seen? I haven't seen Valentino. I haven't seen.
No, pitifully few. I've seen Crimes of Passion.
Oh yeah, okay.
That's really strong. I mean, like really, really well made.
I remember being a teenager and seeing a poster for a film called Whore.
Yeah, with
And I just felt like I'm not watching that. That looks bloody scary.
who is it in that? It's
Teresa
Russell.
Russell.
It's about 1990. There's posters all over for
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I've seen like really woefully little. I've picked up a few in the last year or so that I've keep meaning to watch. Women in Love, and
Oh, yeah.
there's a couple of the compilations of his earlier work are up there that I've still not got
okay.
around to watching. But no, very little. I've got to set aside the time. It's just, you know how it is.
Yeah, I guess there's that anticipation that it's going to be hard work.
It's not just that. It's just there's so much to watch. There's
Mm.
so much to catch up on. And I got to be fair. I was, I've even liking Altered States. I think I liked it more until recent years, just because it was a great like science fiction stroke horror movie.
Sure.
I was taken in by Ken Russell's reputation as like an overblown director of nonsense. And it's only in recent years that I've come to realise that was stupid.
Yeah, it's really unfair.
Yeah, it's really unfair, and I've got to try harder.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he should be up on a pedestal with our other British great. I'm saying that having only seen 10% of his oeuvre, but maybe when I've completed the quest.
So by this point, Emily's been reintroduced to the film after a brief absence. She's been off doing research in Africa.
Yeah, she's studying apes, isn't she?
Yeah,
Primates.
primates. She picks him up from the police station after he's been found in the zoo, having transformed back into himself. He's been found in the zoo. And again, this is one of the key moments where the film could kind of lose its nerve. Emily is not quite convinced at this stage that Jessup is doing anything other than going mad.
Yeah, taking drugs.
Yeah, taking drugs and going mad. They have a brief discussion back at the apartment, and then Mason turns up with his clothes, which he'd left back at the lab, and mentions that there'd been a wild ape running around, which is perhaps the first time that Emily's convinced that what's going on is genuinely going on.
And Mason's like, just tell me they didn't bring an animal down there. Tell me they haven't been experimenting on apes.
And yeah, again, it's I really really appreciate that the film doesn't mess about. It doesn't introduce doubt unnecessarily just for the sake of appearing to be rational. It's not a rational film. It's not a rational premise. It's and you've got to go with it, and the film does. You get a brief interlude at this point where things have to settle down a little bit before what's coming, and then Emily listens to the recordings that were made of the earlier experiment.
Yeah,
where he's grunting like an ape.
Yeah, where he regresses.
And they sound very familiar to her, and she's very frightened because she begins to believe that he really is regressing. And it's quite an important like chessboard character maneuver to have her on board with this now, because this means that when we go into the next big sequence, which is the main experiment, that everybody is on board.
They're all present as well, aren't they? So
they're all present, and they're convinced that the research they're doing is genuine and it is leading to something.
But she's there in two capacities. She's there as a scientist and also as somebody that loves and cares about him as well. She's concerned as well as intrigued. So,
and it's interesting, she takes on the voice of reason, and it's not kind of like a hysterical wife. It is the voice of reason. This is very dangerous research. We should not be doing this. Because even at this, even Mason's on board at this stage. He's being quite quiet, and he's present, convinced, taking part. And I guess this leads us into the big section of the film, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a really spectacular visual sequence, isn't it? This experiment where somehow a combination of the isolation chamber, the drugs, and the belief, the more people that are there, the more belief that's in the room, somehow it just enables, I think in the script it's written as Eddie disassociating into cosmic energy and imploding into a black hole, and all credit to them, they managed to pull that off visually. It's a very, very spectacular sequence.
Before we start to talk about it in depth, I do think it's a very, very clever bit of writing. I always admire this about a film that sets up a concept and then delivers something which feels like the end result of that concept, and then is able to take it further. I wonder how many audience members watching this without too much knowledge of what they were going into would feel that the ape man is kind of like the end result of the experiment.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
There's just that sleight of hand sort of presenting you with the ape man thing, thinking, yeah, you could regress back. This is going to make him regress back to an ape man, and then taking it a step further and saying,
it's really brave.
If you go further with that, you could go right back to the beginning of time. And the beginning of the universe, and that's what we're going to show you.
Yeah, let's see how far we can go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they pull it off. You have this great sequence of, shit just starts exploding. It's too much energy contained in one space, and you see the pipes across the ceiling really like bending and bowing from the force of it. We see the chamber just atomize.
Yeah.
And we see the two male scientists like blown off their feet and
Again,
knocked unconscious.
it's something that feels very validating when you're watching something as like a science fiction viewer, and I find it incredibly satisfying. Just those images of Mason and Arthur, just because they get to finally see objectively on a TV screen
Yeah, that's
what
right.
we've been seeing privately,
Yeah, yeah.
and what we've been,
You see him warp, don't you? See his
you see
head
him warp.
distort and his DNA breaking down in real time.
Yeah,
It's
and then Arthur's absolutely blown away, just staring into the primordial light that's coming
yeah,
through the
yeah,
TV screen. It's just incredibly satisfying as a horror movie viewer to have those kind of definitive "this is happening"
yeah, yeah,
moments.
yeah, yeah. There's no vagaries there at
Yeah,
all, is there?
it's definitely happening. These scientists are seeing
Mm.
it.
Yeah, there's one slightly clunky moment where Emily rushes in to save him, and Mason scoops her up and out of danger, and
Mm.
then sort of bumps her into a wall, and she's unconscious for a few seconds as he goes running back
I
in.
really like that moment, and I really like the way that the sound effects build up and then cut out, and you realise that something really strange and terrible has just happened in the room
Mm-mm.
as we're out of the room, and so you're all the more frightened when Emily has to go in
Yeah,
to
okay.
investigate.
All right, all right. I'll let it pass.
Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. I retract my previous statement. But then when she comes back into the room and it's that swirling vortex, I mean
Yeah.
that's a staggering image,
Mm.
like perfectly executed. I mean, we haven't really talked about Jordan Cronenworth, the
No.
cinematographer. It's probably a good time just to pause and pat him on the back for
Yeah.
a job well done. It looks brilliant. You can see why he was scooped up for Blade Runner.
Yeah. He's a legend, and
Such a beautifully shot film. This actually.
because you obviously I know him from this and from Blade Runner and also from Cutter's Way,
Yeah.
which I think came between the two.
For me, it's State of Grace. I
Yes.
love that movie, State of Grace, and he did such a great job on that as well.
But it's weird when you look at people's IMDb and you see their really groundbreaking work, which
Mm.
for Jordan is this and
Mm.
Blade Runner, and then you are slightly disappointed when you see the later credits, which are you want to see more flamboyant work later
Yeah,
on,
yeah,
but you
sure.
see Gardens of Stone and a Peggy Sue Got Married and
Mm-mm.
stuff. I went and looked the other way on his filmography, and there's so many like little interesting movies that it's going to be almost impossible to find, but I really want to see.
Yeah, yeah. Talking of the vortex, I read in Cinefex they were talking about how that whole sequence, once the tank is disintegrated and you're just left with this vortex swirling in the middle of the room, it's all lit from underneath.
Mm.
So it's a 2.5 inches of perspex, and then all the light is underneath. But once they activated the motors to start swirling the water, it thickened the object that the light had to pass through, because the water is thicker because it's a swirling vortex.
Yeah.
So they had to increase the light by 200% to get it to shine through.
It's we keep referring to this Cinefex article. It's I will try not to go on about how Cinefex was better in the old days than it is now. But if anyone likes this movie and hasn't already, you need to buy issue 4 of Cinefex, which has got Outland. It's got a model shot from Outland on the cover. Because back in those days, Cinefex used to do really in-depth coverage of movies.
Yeah,
The whole production.
It's a book in its own right, isn't it? That article is really dense.
Yeah, it's really good. It's at least 40 pages, beautifully illustrated. It has a slightly condescending tone towards Ken Russell, and
I think the guy writing the article is a Dick Smith fan, isn't he? So
Yeah.
it is mostly about Dick Smith and his work, which is fantastic.
Yeah,
But it ends on Dick Smith just saying that he was dissatisfied that they'd had to adapt his work to make it more
Yeah.
spectacular.
I mean, there was a slight whiff of sour grapes about the article by the time you get to the end, because obviously Dick Smith did a lot of work and he had planned out the transformations in a very linear way. It would be this stage at this point of the film, and this and that, and Ken Russell just kind of went in and took what he liked and used it how he thought
Shuffled it,
best.
didn't he?
Shuffled it.
The stage 2 of the transformation he just threw into one
Yeah,
sequence, and then other bits he just used where he liked, basically.
and you get to the end of the article and you're kind of like, oh, I can understand your point, but the end result, without knowing your dissatisfaction, the end result still works beautifully.
Yeah.
So that's all that matters really at the end.
I guess in terms of the narrative, this is where Emily rescues him
From the abyss.
From the abyss, basically.
Yeah.
Pulls him back, helps to reconstitute him to his
Physical form.
and pulls him back into the world.
Yeah.
I mean, the film doesn't really put any brakes on now. It just roused from this experience. They get home, and then they start to break down again.
Yeah.
There's nothing really
You
in
have
between, is there?
you have a sort of a come down moment where they're all at home and absolutely shell shocked, except for Arthur, who
It's really buzzing, isn't
is
he?
really really buzzing, and is more excited than Jessup about
Yeah,
the implications of the
yeah. He's not the
experiment.
one that's been through the experience, is he? It's, as an observer.
Mason is exhausted and just
Mm.
wants to forget about the whole thing because it's too dangerous, and
Yeah.
he's
His mind
totally
is blown.
convinced,
Yeah,
but he's
that's too much.
it's too much for humanity for anyone to
Mm-mm.
handle. Can we just stop talking about it,
Yeah.
please?
We shouldn't be able to do this, basically. Science
Jessup,
is broken.
yeah, Jessup is exhausted. Emily's about to go into shock, and she explains to Mason how she feels about Jessup and how she's obsessed by him and can't live without him. And then eventually Mason and Arthur leave,
Mm.
and we're left with what feels like the quiet ending of the movie. And then you have kind of like a third act extra shocker.
Yeah, I think what they're going for, it feels like what they're going for is this sort of concept that as Jessup is moving in and out of this fugue state now, he's unlocked something that his mind and his DNA are able to sort of collapse backwards and forwards
At
through
will, yeah.
the genetic inherited history, that maybe the only thing that can keep him anchored to reality is love. It's not too heavy-handed.
A lot of people, a lot of the reviews I've read were very dismissive of this kind of, because the film eventually says the ultimate truth of life is that there is no ultimate truth. I can imagine, if you're expecting to be presented with some ultimate truth, it's a lot to ask of a horror movie, but if you're expecting that somehow,
sure.
you'd be disappointed. But looking at it, with Chevsky's condition, he's nearing the end, and I can see.
But I mean, it does sort of just rely on that, this idea that in the midst of all that chaos, love is the anchor that keeps us present.
But having admitted his love for her, I guess, Jessup then starts to lose his cohesion again, loses physical cohesion.
Yeah, yeah. He unravels again, doesn't he? We see, in quite a breathtaking series of images, we see him breaking down into warped, distorted forms as his DNA collapses in on itself, and it's almost like it's regressing beyond his control. And now, I think the idea of the experiments was that he was always able to guide, and he was signposted back as far as possible. But now he's out of control. His DNA is wild and regressing, and he's mutating, and his wife comes flying in to help him, and at the moment
she touches him, she becomes infected by the dissolution and starts to...
Yeah, the visual effects on her are really special. It's, this skin-tight lava suit with really intense front projections to make it ripple and live. It's really quite incredible to see.
Yeah, and quite horrific as well, because it's...
Well, her arms are shriveling. There's all those little details where you're just like, that's fucking horrible.
Yeah, that's really, it's really horrible what's happening to her.
It looks really painful. And there's one shot where they just cut to her with this sort of withering form, and she's obviously in agony, but all you hear is this sort of heat haze. There's a heat haze shimmering across her, and then this sort of noise, and you can't even hear her screams for help. It's really, really upsetting.
Obviously, but when his dissolution starts, you kind of get some kind of flash imagery, and he starts fighting it in a scene I've seen parodied a couple of times, once in South Park.
Oh yeah, okay.
He starts
thumping the wall.
Yeah, he's literally thumping his fist from one wall to another, trying to...
I mean, it's hard. I mean, how else would you do it? It's
just remind yourself of your physicality.
It's the physical form, isn't it? And trying to allow the conscious mind to reconstitute your DNA. It's a tricky one. I can't see how else they would have done it, but it sometimes looks a bit like I want to break free, doesn't it? It's sort of...
I think it's absolutely captivating. There's some stunning like 1, 2, 3 frame edits in there where you're cutting between different forms within the action as he's pounding the wall. And the interview in Seeing Effects, but Bran Ferren, the guy who did a lot of the optical effects, did all the optical effects for this, and was brought in particularly to punch up this sequence.
It's sort of heralded as the first CGI stuff, isn't it? Because they use computer rotoscoping, which had never been done.
He says that they were using a lot of different imagery, and he says if you look carefully at the sequence of, where he's punching the walls, there's a lot of shots that, if you go through it frame by frame, that don't really work, where he's not in the right position.
Yeah.
But it's seamless. It
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
watching it just feels absolutely real.
Well, considering they're under like a quarter a ton of rubber, both of the performances are still very
Yeah.
much like in the space, aren't they?
Yeah.
Utterly convincing. You feel the confusion and the terror and
Mm.
the agony is all happening, as well as all the VFX and
Yeah.
the music, and it's yeah.
It's a very powerful scene. And Jessup eventually does manage to bring himself violently back to human form, and then wanders over and redeems Emily as well, brings her back to physicality. They sort of wink out of existence for a moment and then return as themselves.
Big spark of nothing, and then
Mm.
they declare their love, and then
He declares his love for the first time, tells her he loves her for the first time.
and the credits start. Like
the credits start.
It just ends so abruptly.
I always wonder though, and I've been thinking about it more since I last viewed it, and you don't really consider these things when you're watching it younger, but as an adult, do you think Eddie survives? I have a feeling that
I don't know, man.
having viewed him being so detached from humanity
Mm.
for his entire life, and then having achieved his goal to learn what the truth of life is, and learn that it's nothing, and the only thing redeeming him is this somewhat tenuous relationship with his wife and family, because he's not the most loving of husbands.
Yeah, yeah.
I do think, I personally feel that later on, after the credits have rolled at some point in his life, he's just going to wink into nothing.
Mm.
I don't think that would hold him to reality.
Well, also seeing how affected his DNA is by the experiments, do we just accept that he would be genetically stable after this, that he's not going to
Exactly.
complete
If so much of this is dependent on his...
lecturing and just turn into a primordial blob and then snap back? Sorry about that. Now, where was I?
I do feel that if so much of his actual real physical existence depends on his state of mind now, that at some point he might go into a slump and just disappear one night.
Yeah, I think, when you sort of imagine what happens after the credits roll, this idea that, what does he do? Does he share his research with everyone? Do isolation tanks?
I mean, it's a terrifying thing to unleash on the world, isn't it?
Yeah,
You wouldn't want.
it. Yeah.
I mean, the film
Does it
kind
happen then on every campus around the world? Is there an army of DNA explorers?
It's one of those things. It's like the end of Primer, I guess, isn't it? Where
Mhm.
they are off building government-sponsored bigger time machines somewhere.
Yeah.
But with this, it's just too. I think it's just too dangerous a concept.
Mm.
I mean, the film kind of suggests that Eddie is sort of a messianic figure who, because of his background, might be the only person who could crack this,
Mm-mm.
and it would only happen to him. But if not, then surely it's not something you could share with the world. It's not something for fear of what might happen.
Yeah, or maybe it's something you should share with the world and unleash, put an end to organised religion and unleash the academics.
Mm.
A bunch of random notes left over. I wrote down a word that they used in Cinefex to describe Eddie's job. They call him a psychophysiologist,
Okay.
which I just liked seeing on the page, lots of P's and Y's. And then I also wrote down the word zoomorphic, because that's how they describe Ken Russell's work, which I took to mean he uses lots of zoom lenses. Morphic, anamorphic, zoomorphic. But then when I looked it up, it actually meant lots of animal-based imagery. So
I prefer your definition.
yeah,
to be honest.
yeah. And then just really the soundtrack, which I think was it Waxwork released a version of last year,
Yes.
or the year before,
Thank you for that.
and also the poster image, which I think we both have a copy of.
Yes, again, thank you for
Which
that.
is
It's hanging downstairs in the lounge as we speak.
Yeah. The foil version of that poster it's quite a great
It's beautiful, yeah.
poster. Yeah, definitely.
It's a
of
very,
its time.
it's like a very, very iconic poster. And another reason that I'm really pissed off with Warner Brothers for the way they treated it on Blu-ray is that they've lost that imagery. Like it's kept that poster on the cover all the way through, right up until DVD.
Oh, okay, what did they go with?
Just
Picture of William Hurt.
like a profile of William Hurt photoshopped with the logo in not in the
Not in the
original,
correct font.
Yeah, just a
Oh
bog
my
standard bullshit
Oh,
cover.
dear.
Yeah, it's an amazing poster. The soundtrack is I've got it on CD, and you've got me the beautiful vinyl edition, which was composer approved with liner notes by the.
Yeah.
It's not something I listen to for pleasure.
Yeah, of course.
I like the opening
It's
theme.
more for a collector to be a bit more complete, isn't it? You know.
Mm. I bought it on CD. Thought, oh yeah, I really love that soundtrack in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not one. I do listen to a lot of soundtracks for pleasure
Yeah,
outside of the
sure.
movie, and
Mm.
sometimes soundtracks for movies that I haven't seen.
Mm.
This one is works absolute gangbusters in the movie.
Mm-mm.
It's a third of the film, I'd say.
Yeah.
But I can't listen to it outside of
Yeah,
that.
sure, sure.
I like Altered States.
Me too.
Um, it still has. I've discovered people in unexpected situations who like the movie. I
Yeah.
think it's still obviously because it has hallucinatory drug referencey type things. It does have a big stoner following.
Yeah, it's never going to go out of fashion, is it?
Yeah,
As long as kids keep taking drugs,
and I
there's a
remember
place for altered states.
I was working on an extremely mundane commercial, and the director had a friend of hers in, and they were talking about this script that they were developing to do with drugs and something, and then one of them said, "Oh yeah," and then we'll go into the bit about the cosmic vortex, and I just turned around and said, "That sounds very Altered States," and they're like, "Yeah, yeah, oh, we love Altered States. It's one of my
Mm.
favourite movies." As a sci-fi movie and a horror movie, it's kind of receded over the years. I don't think it's got the same following it used to have,
Well, I
but
think, but it is a challenging film. The dialogue, you have to pay attention to the dialogue to really buy into the concept. You have
mm,
to listen to the characters. You have to follow their threads of thought
mm,
and some of the abstract concepts they're trying to manifest. So I can imagine if you have a low attention span, you're just going to find it frustrating because you won't really have understood what's going on.
it's crazy though because it moves so quickly and
I
everything's
know
so
it's
eloquent and succinct that
yeah, I
it's
think it's great, but I
mm,
could see why
yeah.
a modern audience. No, maybe that's unfair, but you know, it doesn't sit as comfortably in the modern landscape of cinema.
Yeah. Do you know what? Something that occurred to me, which I made a note of and then forgot about, is what an influence this movie must have had on Gaspar Noé.
Oh yeah, okay.
If you compare this to Irreversible
Mm,
and Enter the Void, particularly,
mm.
there's that feeling of the cosmic in those two movies
Yeah,
of
yeah.
his, particularly at the end of Irreversible, with where the camera eventually whirls off into
Mm,
space and time, and then says time destroys all things at the
mm.
end. And that's if that's not from Altered States, I don't know what it is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
Um,
but I think any people that are taking lots of drugs are probably thinking about the cosmic enormity of life and
and with that in mind, I'd imagine it might find a new audience. I just think it's slid off the charts a bit.
yeah, it's frustrating that, isn't it? Because it's really good. It's a really quality film.
Yeah, but it's really vivid and punchy and
It's fast paced. It's really smart script, great effects, great performances. Like maybe a little abrupt at the climax, but
mm.
who isn't?